Hello, and welcome to the Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian Pagan and Kemetic practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon. Today I wanted to review a couple of books for you. This first one, Religion in Roman Egypt, I picked this up back in March, and I really wanted to recommend this one. It's a very interesting book. The writing style of it, oh, by the way, it's by David Frankfurter. The writing style is a little hard to read on this one. It's a scholarly book, and reading through the footnotes kind of drove me crazy. I had to go back and reread some things just because of the style of language that he uses. But this is a very interesting book if you want to know more about the very end of the pagan era. People have asked online, when did the Egyptian religion die out? Actually, if you read this book, you'll discover that it was much later than you might think. A lot of people point to things like the Serapeum being destroyed in Alexandria in the 300s, or the Edict of Theodosius in 381 that made Nicene Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire. But actually, this book talks about things like sort of an ideological war going back and forth between a Coptic bishop and a local pagan in Egypt, who actually hosted feast days out of his own house. And it was very, very interesting stuff. And another thing that another assumption that this book challenges is that by the Greco-Roman period, Egyptian religion wasn't really pure anymore. It was getting all these Hellenistic ideas. Well, you had some of that, but there were people who were doing traditional religion. And I kind of wish I had this book when I was writing Following the Sun, but my next book will have some information from this one in it. One of the interesting things that's in here is it has some spells on divination and a prayer to Set under the name Typhon. In this book, there's a section talking about him. That's another assumption that, by that point, nobody worships Set anymore. Actually, he's got some information on that. So this is a really fun book. This next one is very popular right now, Eternal Egypt by Richard Reedy. I got this book because I know there are a lot of folks that are into Kemetic Reconstructionism that have bought this book. It's got a lot of reviews on Amazon, but frankly, this book ticked me off. To give the positive end on it, he explains certain things very well, the difference between Ma'at and Isfet, and the nature of Egyptian polytheism, why it wasn't just kind of a monotheism in disguise. He explains some things like that very well. And he's got a great bibliography, very well researched. There's some things in his bibliography that I want to get hold of. They're going on my wish list. But beyond that, the author of this book, and it's on the back cover, and he explains it in one of the introductions to a particular rite. He was originally trained as a minister. He got a master's in divinity. What's funny is when you read this, he still sounds preachy. And there are several points where he basically says that our society is fad-driven and immoral, but through Kemetic worship, you can it puts us in a more cosmic state. He might as well say a more heavenly state. Congratulations, you're a Kemetic Protestant preacher. Please skip the sermon and just give us the rites. Beyond that, there's a couple of important points that he misses. And the reason why these are important is not just about, I know more, information than you. It's not about getting minutiae right. There are certain things that it'll affect how we understand Egyptian religion. The first thing is, he claims in the introduction to the morning ritual in the Temple of Amun-Ra, which, by the way, he says this was the rite that was practiced in Heliopolis, or Inu. That's wrong. They worshipped Amun-Ra in Karnak, which was in Thebes. Big difference. But beyond that, he claims that we have all of the important texts, and that the religion stayed mostly unchanged throughout Egyptian history. That's not true. Egyptian religion was not static. It was very dynamic, and it changed quite a bit. He keeps saying in here, and this is a pet peeve of mine, that we shouldn't be picking and choosing and cutting things out, but he does it in here. And not only that, the Egyptians themselves did it. Because if you look at the pyramid text, for example, and he does use several pyramid texts in here, but the problem is, you look at the pyramid text from the first tomb that they were put in, which was the pyramid of King Unas. The opening of the mouth rite, the morning rite, they're all in there. They're short, sweet, da 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 da, wham bam, thank you ma'am. But by the time you get to King Pepi the First or Pepi the Second, those rites that, in James Allen's translation, he separates those out by pharaoh. So you can see the changes over time. By the time you get a few generations beyond that, they're pages and pages long. And does that mean that the ones that, the short, sweet, and simple ones that you had in King Unas' pyramid are any less valid? Of course not. The flip side also occurred. In the coffin text, and by the way, I have a copy of that, and I'm reading. I wouldn't recommend that for anybody unless you're a very serious scholar, unless you're going to school in Egyptology, because for one, it's pretty expensive, and two, even scholars tear their hair out trying to read those, because there are lots of mistakes in the originals. The people who were trying to copy them in ancient times made a lot of errors. But you can look at them and you can see, for example, I must have gone through 20 pages worth of spells on not eating feces in the underworld. You have a couple of those same spells by the time you reach the Book of the Dead, but you don't have all of them anymore. The Egyptians said, you know what, let's stick to these here. And what's funny is people who ordered copies of the Book of the Dead also picked and chose which spells they wanted. So why is it that they can do it and we can't? The other problem that he has, and this goes back to his training. He was trained as a minister, so of course he's going to identify with the priests more and assume that the priestly knowledge is the most important. Well, there's a very big debate in Egyptology over how much does the text from temple walls and from the pyramid texts and so on reflect the religion of the entire population. Debates range on how literate Egyptian society was. Some people think that less than 10% of all ancient Egyptians were literate. Some people say it was a bigger number than that. Well, what does that have to do with religion? Well, if you can't read any of this, in the hieroglyphic original, you're not going to be able to do it every morning. The average peasant living in a mud brick house, along the Nile Valley, they wouldn't have been able to go through all of this. But is it any less valid when you have a peasant farmer and his family climb out of their hut in the morning and raise their hands to Ra and pray, for what they need for that day? Of course not. That has a direct influence on us, because just like our forebears, the spiritual forebears, the people of Egypt, we work, we go to school, we live with parents, in some cases. I'd like for those of you who have this book to sound off and tell me, how long does it take to do some of these rites? Because I can only imagine somebody trying to do one of these things and then hearing, honey, what are you doing in there? That's going to be very difficult. The guy that wrote this book has a couple of temples in California, and that's great. I'd love to see them one day, but for most of us, we're the only lonely Egyptian pagan in our community. We don't have a temple that we can go to, and there's a lot of issues of practicality that I find in this book. Another thing is he bothers to list things that you'll need for particular rites. Well, he probably needs to put some things in here like, for example, visqueen to put on your floor, because if you're going to be sprinkling sand as part of a rite, I'm not sprinkling sand on my carpet, thank you very much. So, again, that's just another issue of some practicalities that I find with this. So if you have this book, go ahead, chop through it. If you see some stuff in here that you really like in one of the rites, like the rite for the evening, or there's a rite for Sekhmet, one for Set, one for Jehuti, better known as Tot. If you want to use one of those, don't feel bad if you have to abridge it. If you don't have this book, it's up to you if you want to get it. You could probably make some use of it, but if you want to know some rites and things that you can do for your own practice, You can go to my website. You can check other videos here on YouTube. I believe Aset Priestess and Egyptian have some great videos on their channels. And I'll try to get some more information up. Post questions, ask. That's what, the online community is for. So don't let anybody tell you that, oh my God, you have to do it this way. The Egyptians had to adapt, throughout their history, and we're no different. So hopefully this will give you some helpful information for your own Kemetic or Egyptian pagan practice. So for the Kemetic How-To Guide, this is Sharon, wishing you Synepti.